So, hello, this is Office Hours with the Mad Professor. I'm Liam O'Mara, and as usual, we're going to have a different discussion each time we round and try to dive deep into a particular topic. I want to provide something that can stimulate us, get people thinking about things. And this time around, we've got an opportunity to discuss something that seems kind of rare in our society, especially given how tribalistic politics has really gotten since the 1990s. People often don't shift positions. They tend to stay in one place. And I think what we can see here is that through discussion, engagement, through getting outside of your comfort zones, you never know what's going to happen. So we're going to talk with Conor McGarry, who's going to walk us through some of the changes that have happened in his own sort of like personal odyssey over the last 10 years. So, how's it going, Conor?
Going good. Thank you for having me on here, Liam. Speaking about going out of your comfort zone and like making an really political transformation. Yeah, I don't want to say transformation because that gives it kind of a, but maybe like shifting. Yeah, shifting. Like for me, like I was growing up and especially in college, like I would call myself a right-wing libertarian. Well, because libertarian in the U.S. context just is
Right.
so
Big L libertarian.
Yeah, I voted Gary Johnson for my first time for president in 2012. I voted Gary Johnson. 2016 voted Johnson, and then 2020 I will say like voted for Bernie Sanders, and now like my political transition, like I would call myself essentially at this point a Marxist-Leninist Maoist. Like I kind of went, yeah.
That's a pretty interesting shift, and for people who are aware of the way that the political compass works, the sort of like two-axis breakdown of political thought, where you've got an economic one sort of stretched across in the center there, and going from more private control to less private control, communal ownership at the left there, and then your socio-political, like along the up and down between like authoritarian and and libertarian. So a right libertarian position is generally in the bottom right of that, and you end up, that's where your whole like Ron Paul and Rand Paul, and I think you were a Rand Paul supporter when we met, right?
Yeah, I mean, actually, yeah. I mean, this I can go into a lot more detail, but just to show, like, illustrate how much really politically I've shifted. Like, I was actually a student for Rand. I got organizer in 2016 when he was running for president. This is when Trump, that whole era really first started. And yeah, like I was in, I went to CPAC. I was trying to get him he helped win the CPAC poll at the time. And yeah, after the Iowa caucus, which he lost pretty badly when he dropped out, that's when, right. I mean, I don't know if Liam can remember, but like I actually had a Rand Paul bumper stickers on my car. I had a Students for Rand sticker. Like I was trying to organize poll banks.
Yeah, exactly. I remember the Rand sticker and the Students for Liberty kind of stuff. Yeah. For the Marxist-Leninist side of it, the interesting thing about it, and it gets kind of weird in a way, because frequently we tend to associate Marxist-Leninists with like the upper left, a more kind of like authoritarian socialist ideal. So it would be like straight across diagonally, which you're moving on both axes, which is even more rare. Although, to be fair, Marxism and even Marxist-Leninism is not necessarily authoritarian. It's often, at best, maybe like centrist there. Up at the top is where we generally put like the Stalinist sort of dictatorship, various periods in the Marxist-Leninist Maoist experiments. But as a philosophy, it's not necessarily authoritarian. It just tends to be that in practice for most people's understanding of it. So just if we describe a move from right libertarian to Marxist-Leninist or Maoist, it sort of looks really sharp.
Yeah, it's like, what is it, like an old classic y-axis? It's like doing that pretty much.
Yeah, it's a shooting way over. And I think if I'm gonna guess, and we can hit that as we're kind of like going along here, but I'm gonna guess for you it's a bit more straight across, where where it's more of sort of the traditional, Marxist or even Marxist-Leninist ideals, where it's like, well, the state, but we're going to dismantle the state eventually, and a bit more like that. Does that seem fair, or?
Yeah, I mean, because like my honest take, like I do think there's a lot of, especially here where like in the U.S. there still is a strong like anti-communist, anti-socialist bent still in all the political discussions, because most of the time ML, I'm just gonna say ML for short at this point,
Sure.
is usually referred to again. You think USSR, Mao's China, and it's like yeah, they do play a role. Like there's still MLs that, but it's also like doesn't do my take on those states are definitely more nuanced now. Doesn't mean I let's say stand the Soviet Union. No. And the issue I also will say, like even based off again how I've analyzed what's conditions, I'm gonna say yeah. I don't think I think there's too many issues. Some people tend to romanticize the USSR, and it's like what besides that kind of weird romanticization, that model will not work here in the U.S. because the primary contradictions, economic situation is just so different that yeah, and that's where I think, and that's kind of how I look at it.
Honestly, I think that
I'm not like sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say it gets to one of the bits of weirdness in people's reception of the entire Marxist-Leninist trend. There is the way that Stalinism has affected our perception of it. I mean, when Stalin essentially betrayed the inherently internationalist bent of that revolution and went for the whole like socialism in one state, which lends to, well, essentially an authoritarian dictatorship in one country, you know?
Yep.
When you're talking about socialism, one of the challenges, and this is a challenge for revolutionary socialists, it's a challenge for evolutionary socialists, it's a challenge for just socialism as a concept at all. And here we have to distinguish the whole like social democratic trends, your whole like Bernie Sanders stuff that isn't actually socialist, but like socialism itself really doesn't fit well within nation state lines. And it does tend to complicate it. And I think that so much of our reception of the concept ever since has been colored by the fact that it was attempted that way. So people will talk about socialist countries. They'll talk about like, Vietnam and China and the Soviet Union as socialist countries. When restriction within those kind of borders already sort of breaks the whole point of socialism, doesn't it?
Well, again, the other issue too, I would say, is that well, I personally do have a bit of critique about. Again, I do think I have my own critiques of the authoritarian versus libertarian sort of framing because I think there's a lot more in the middle. And
right.
As even like Ukrainian anarchists or Mako's, again, I'm probably butchering his name, but like during the Russian Civil War, absolutely did engage in what could be seen as authoritarian practices. Same thing with Spanish anarchists, like
right.
And that's like again doesn't mean I'm justifying what the Soviet Union did wrong. I mean, come on, we have to admit they did do a lot of wrong shit. But I also think the issue, especially here, where we're again, there's so much focus on the secret police, on like the Gulag system, when like even Soviet history in of itself is very, very domestically, internationally has been complicated to say the least. And I think that's the issue here when we hear the term. And I think a lot of that just how much the stuff got skewed here in the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find that I run into that problem a lot in discussions with people because you run into a kind of knee-jerk absolutism about what these things really mean and what they do. And there's a certain perception of them that is hard for people to get past. And I think where I'll often confuse the more black and white thinkers in conversations is that I have a tendency to give credit where credit is due. So we have to, on the one hand, acknowledge that the Soviet Union was an authoritarian shithole that did kill a lot of its own people. Right? It's not, but at the same time, you immediately run into an issue with a lot of the, especially a lot of Americans who've grown up with a lot of Cold War era propaganda sort of being, or today still being recycled at them. They want to massively exaggerate Stalin's death toll. Stalin killed millions. Stalin did not kill 20 million. It would be literally impossible for him to have killed 20 million because we can see the population steadily rising. but he did kill millions. Probably closer to 6, 7, maybe total. I mean, even when you count in, the Holodomor in Ukraine, as well as the Gulag system and the purges and everything else, it comes up to a pretty nasty total, but it's nothing like the Nazis. But as soon as you say that, as soon as you say, well, the Soviet Union didn't kill as many people as your weird propaganda told you, suddenly for people you become like an apologist. And then, oh, you're pro-Soviet. That question of nuance that you're raising here, I think, is a really important one for political dialogue in general. It seems that so many people are predisposed to ignore all nuance. You're forced to ignore large parts of the facts. We can't talk about, the Soviets managed to house the homeless. They managed to, actually deal with the question of extreme poverty. They took what was essentially a feudal agrarian state and made it into an industrial power. Did they do a lot of it in the wrong way? Oh, hell yeah. Did they pollute the hell out of the country? Oh, hell yeah. But you still, as soon as you acknowledge any positive, as soon as you say any good thing they've done, it immediately blinders appear for people.
Yep. And also, too, the other thing, too, is also that it makes it easy to overlook the crimes of, your own country. And I will still say in terms of, and also, yeah, I mean, given what the Soviet Union came out of, you have the Russian Civil War, which I'm surprised, it's, the amount of damage it did to Eastern Europe and parts of Russia. You're talking tens of millions, and starvation caused by a war ignited by the White Armies. And it's, again, it's more complicated than that, but obviously, I think given what the Soviet Union had to come out of,
right,
trying to rebuild, and especially World War II, given how much damage had happened. I mean, does it mean I'm okay with what happened with some of the Warsaw Pact era nations? No, but it's also
right.
I also think the Soviet Union is such the go-to, and it's what about Vietnam? That country, which again, you're talking French, what the French did to Vietnam. You also have, again, the American invasion. You have the fact that they actually took out the Khmer Rouge, and despite the U.S. supporting them, and even Mao's China, even China did support the Khmer Rouge. I will say some Maoists tend to overlook that. That's just my own personal critique. But it's in Vietnam, the fact that they had to rebuild large chunks. I can't remember the name of the area they controlled, but they had to rebuild it, while also coming off a brutal war that the Americans and the French helped set up.
Right.
And also the Chinese invasion in the late 70s.
Yeah, we totally ignore all these things, and a lot of it just comes from a very nationalistic and propagandistic understanding of things. This is one thing I run into particularly, and seriously, no offense to anybody who doesn't go to college, because a lot of the population is never going to go to college, and you don't need to. But we could do a much better job of teaching a lot of basic critical reasoning skills if we didn't hit people with so much aggressive propaganda earlier in life. So much of earlier education really is a kind of propaganda to give you just whatever basic tools the country thinks you need, and then college has to sort of unpack some of that and break some of the conditioning. You end up with the high school version of history, which is quite different from what I do for a living, such a simplistic portrait of so many of these things that when you talk about the Vietnam War, there's no time to talk about the long history of French colonialism and just how much they fucked that society up. And then an extremely brutal war under the Japanese and the occupation there, and then an extremely brutal war against the French all the way up until 1954, and then you ignore the fact that we were paying for the French's war in the last few years, and then immediately moved in afterwards and sabotaged the reunification, such that by the time you get to warfare, these societies are often so fractured. There again, there's I think a problem a lot of people have with nuance on issues like this. So I think of it this way. You mentioned the whole Warsaw Pact countries, or what became the Warsaw Pact, the Eastern European satellite states of the Soviets. Now, on the one hand, we can point out that abandoning all those governments in exile and forcibly changing borders to annex territory and then imposing communist dictatorships and seizing tons of the territory, the industrial production to make up for Soviet damages, all kinds of things. The Soviets treated the Eastern European states like crap. And we have to acknowledge there's a kind of imperialism going on there in that kind of control. But as soon as you point out the reason for it, for a lot of people it becomes like you're somehow justifying or apologizing for it. There's no way to justify Stalin's paranoia or viciousness or the treatment of those states. But if you think for a second, in like a 25 some year period, the Russians were invaded twice from the West, each time suffering massive casualties, and the second time really horrific, more than 20 million casualties. You can kind of understand why they were obsessed with creating some kind of buffer.
Yeah.
And then you run into another problem too, because as soon as you begin addressing some of the misunderstandings and provocations along the way. Okay, so we're just casually using this term Warsaw Pact, and in doing that, we're kind of forgetting that the Warsaw Pact dates from what, 55?
Yeah, you're still talking about a couple years even after NATO was formed.
And NATO was formed in 49. And we forget completely that it wasn't the Soviets deciding to hold on to East Germany and create their own little satellite there. It was the American decision to sabotage the reunification because the Soviets insisted that a reunified Germany would be a neutral country and disarmed. Like, it wouldn't be a military threat to anyone, because these fuckers are not invading us again. And I get that. Like, okay, I mean, that'd have been pretty bad.
It's a rational fear. It's a very rational fear.
It is. It's a very rational fear. I mean, Stalin was paranoid as hell, but that is a rational fear given what the Germans had done twice in a 25-year period. And the U.S. wanted German industrial might to join its own alliance. So we unilaterally created West Germany and then put West Germany in NATO, which put the Soviets on the defensive. So and the problem here is that as soon as you bring that up, for people, you're like, oh, you're justifying what the Soviets... No, it's not the point at all. But there's an essential nuance that you miss there.
Yeah, the other thing, too, is also usually gets left out of these discussions is the fact that even within the... for the sake of just simplicity, I'm just going to keep saying Warsaw Pact nations.
It's fine, yeah.
It's just, even like the story within like East Germany or Czechoslovakia, or even like, I mean, Romania is kind of because Clemens, I'm butchering his name, but Clemenceau was kind of really a problem even with
Ceausescu? Yeah.
But like, even like, there still is a lot of like, even today, I forgot the term of nostalgia for, like, again, the Polish People's Republic. You have, and there still was the fact that economically, these countries, after quote unquote, again, U.S. socialism for the sake of the word left, economically they basically dipped, and a lot of it's like there still is like, I've ran to people who to this day who are still like, yeah, whatever, the Soviets may have been a dick, but I had 3 hots and a cot and a job to go to in healthcare, like, it's,
right, yeah. And we totally miss that because we think that, well, we have freedom and freedom is good and all this. And you just miss that, like, the East German economy completely tanked when the government fell apart there. And, I mean, it went from a tidy little country with a functioning economy where people at least had jobs and healthcare and childcare and everything else, to a crime-ridden wasteland of graffiti and trash where most of the jobs disappeared. I mean, unemployment shoots up to 20%. It slowly recovers, but you can kind of understand why there is, within like the left party in Germany, a certain hankering for that, because the people who went through that transformation, they saw a significant decline in their living standards. It's hard because we're sort of conditioned to think only in one term, to sort of connect the political freedom and sort of the economics of it. Yep. And really they're two different things. Someone can be better off, in terms of their lifestyle, and live in a horrifying dictatorship and hate it the whole time, and dislike the fact that it's a dictatorship, but they're fine with it because at least they can, take care of their family. And then there are places where you're given freedom and you can vote, and you have such a hard time feeding your kids that you just don't care, and you're willing to sacrifice those freedoms. And it's so tough because we're always making those easy judgment calls because we have both, right? We have a decent standard of living and a decent amount of political freedom. And most of the world has had to choose one or the other because of the circumstances they were forced into.
And that's for me where, like, I'm a firm believer, like, again, have your critiques. Again, but also don't, for lack of a better word, shit on these experiments. It's where, like, I prefer the term experiment, again, like the USSR. China is still an experiment. Vietnam, the Zapatista project, Cuba. I prefer frame them as experiments because, like, just saying, oh, communist states or socialist states or project or experiment kind of adds more of like an actual kind of nuance and flexibility to it. And it's like, I think it's so easy for us here in the West. I mean, when I say the West, that's Canada, US, Australia, Europe. To just like, they're a bunch of goddamn communists, or like they hate the communists. It's like, no, especially like in a lot of like, especially in like, okay, correct me if I'm the wrong term, but like in Middle Eastern, North African politics, like there's a lot more other nuance. Same thing in Asia.
Absolutely.
It's not just it's like even in Hong Kong, it's not just anti-CPC and pro-America. There's even like a lot of anarchists and Marxists.
You can be anti-imperialist and anti-communist. Like you can hate, both sides of something.
Yeah. And it's also like the fact of the matter is, especially like, again, I keep referring to, again, like Rojava, for example, which is an active war zone, and the fact that they do have to cooperate with the Americans, of course, like that's the go-to, but it's also like you have they do work with the Russians, they do work with the Assad regime on a case-by-case basis. They also can't exactly be too radical with a lot of the peoples there, because like there's
a lot of diversity. There's tons of Christians, there's tons of Sunnis, and they're forced even to work with the Turks to some degree, which is bizarre to watch. Given that the Turks are literally invading to crush them, but you're still forced to accommodate yourself to a reality, and that I think is the hard part for people is the circumstances often force you to make compromises.
I will go on record and say fuck Turkey.
Well, sorry. I mean, I'll say like fuck Erdogan, and basically like the nationalist perspective in Turkey,
But like in this, I mean, I will say up the TKLP, the Turkish Maoists. Okay, enough before it gets too.
Turkey honestly has no truly good political parties or options, which is kind of typical in many ways. I mean, I think a lot of Americans can relate to that as well. Sometimes you're forced into just strategic voting. What's my least bad option here?
But it's also kind of like it's easy for us to make these judgment calls because I do think too many, like, again, when I say anti-authoritarian left, I know what you're talking about, like the libertarian left, or like anarchists, for example. I think kind of fetishize and romanticize the Rojava project a bit too much. Like there's a lot of like, because again, like the image of like the YPJ with the guns fighting ISIS and the foreign volunteers going over, which actually is kind of problematic in its own way. I mean, that's a separate issue, but like there's a lot of fetishization, romanticization of the project from like a lot of like the libertarian left anarchists in the West. But I will also say, and this is again my own personal opinion, that I think too many MLs do kind of completely swipe it away in a lot of ways. And again, like it's much more complicated than just the sake of this video, but it's like it's also like I can't blame them too much for wanting to, in the middle of a war zone, facing the invasion by Erdogan's forces, for wanting to. It's hard, especially in the comfort of my apartment. You can't make those decisions on their people.
Exactly, and there really is a kind of privilege that comes up in a lot of our judgment calls on things, and we basically have the privilege to wipe away a lot of the nuance because we've not been forced to make a lot of those choices. And recognizing that privilege and recognizing the complexity of the situation and that there were no good options, so they picked what they thought they had to do, that doesn't justify a decision. So I mean, it doesn't, even trying to explain something doesn't say this was the perfect choice. It just says they made the decision that they thought they had to in really extraordinary circumstances. And we forget that the situation in a lot of less well-developed countries is so different, and you are forced into so many more complications. And we also, speaking of privilege here, you made a really good point, I think, in referring to the various attempts to realize socialism as experiments. And I think that at this point, we have a tendency to forget that liberal democracy was also an experiment, and also a really difficult one that went through a lot of growing pains and a lot of horrific wars. I mean, gosh, where do you even start with that sort of attempt? The English Civil War devolving into dictatorship, the French Revolution devolving into dictatorship and empire and the guillotine and everything else. How about the American War of Independence and our Constitution? Yeah, great, equality, and slavery, and then a civil war, and I don't know, think about the world wars in Europe that they had to go through in order to finally stabilize representative governments. And now we'll look and we'll like shit on the Hungarians for the kind of illiberal democracy there. And we leave out the fact that they didn't have the long stretch that France has had and now Germany has had to sort of like figure out how this liberal democracy thing works, to kind of get their sea legs, so to speak.
It's the same thing with like the post-colonial world in Africa, like for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the fact, how to say it again, when you stripped, and I'm going to say they are still stripping so many resources from the continent. Again, like I don't want to say, I have some critiques about the framing of the third world, but like I'm just going to say, but like the post-colonial, the states that were former colonies,
right? And exactly, the global South, whatever you want to call them. Yeah.
These states, these countries were robbed and siphoned, and the fact that like King Leopold II is still not considered one of the biggest mass murders in human history.
Yeah, and there's still statues of the guy. I mean, 12 million killed.
Yeah, and these countries were robbed, stripped of their resources. The infrastructure was used to siphon, that was developed under the Europeans, was used to siphon out resources. And you deliberately split populations against each other. You carve up the borders artificially in a map in a room in London or Paris. Yep. And you also, and the fact that when you give them independence, you don't give them the structure, the guidelines, the development to build it. How can you're setting them up for failure? And you know what that gives the fact that like the Francophile world. The fact that how many of these former French colonies still have to have entire parts of their national reserves in French banks? How is that still not colonialist?
It is. I mean, what we did was we created a kind of neocolonial framework in breaking apart most of the former colonized world that allowed the companies in Europe to continue to exploit those resources without those countries having to occupy the territory militarily. And then people have the gall to take the sort of like racist view that, these Africans can't govern themselves. I'm like, well, no, when France left, they specifically chose a particular group of assholes to put in charge to exploit the country because they wouldn't oppose what France wanted to continue doing. You put those greedy kleptocrats in charge, and then we flip it around and accuse these areas, after having endured the century of colonization, of somehow being unable to govern themselves immediately out of the bag. And it's sort of similar to the different socialist experiments. It's difficult to do anything new, and we forget today just how hard and disruptive the transition to industrial capitalism was. I mean, how much it shook up the social fabric in the 18th and 19th century. We forget just how destructive and bloody the transition to liberal democracy was. And this wasn't just given to us.
And I will still say, like, capitalism, again, this is where, like, the Black Book, the death toll was so fucking exaggerated. Like, pardon my French. Sorry if I curse, but...
No. The Black Book of Capitalism is bullshit.
Well, communism, I meant.
Communism, sorry. The Black Book of Communism. Yeah.
Even if we use the logic that, again, it's 100 million deaths, capitalism has still killed far more.
Sure, yeah.
Like, it's even if the framework is BS, but the fact that even if you use that BS framework, capitalism has still is killing way more people.
Right, yeah, especially when people want to try and give a pass to certain elements of it. They want to say, "Oh, well, that's not real capitalism." But then someone says, "Well, that's not real social." Well, then you can't do that. They want to like combine the complicated or corrupted political systems with the economic system, but they want to separate the economic system from the political system so that they can say, well, the slave trade wasn't capitalism, and imperialism wasn't capitalism, and the world wars weren't capitalism, completely ignoring the fact that profit drove all three. Yeah. So the death toll of the world wars and of imperialism and colonialism is actually at capitalism's feet, but we give it a free pass. And I think that comes largely from the very nationalistic sort of framing people get in early understandings, the earlier education, where you leave out all the nuance and you only get the basic good guys and bad guys narrative. One of the things that diving a bit deeper into any of this stuff does is it doesn't make you an apologist for communism or this or that. What it does is it basically shows you that there are no real good guys. There's just flawed experiments everywhere you look. People are just people struggling to make something work, and some things go badly and others do not.
Yeah. The other thing, too, is also that we forget, especially, I like how you frame it in like a kind of good guys, bad guys narrative. But when you're talking about why that's that nuance, like the fact that the United States reputation outside I'm starting to see that starting to crack a lot here, especially with like millennial and the Gen Z generation. But like outside the world, the U.S. reputation is.
It's actually been bad for a long time, and we tend to forget that because we're so spoiled and cut off. We have two friendly neighbors, two giant oceans, and we just don't have to deal with people on the same level. Goods come to us, and we don't have to bother learning anyone else's language. And I think that blinds us to the fact that, especially since the World War II era, our reputation has really taken a nosedive around the world. I mean, most people learn that we provoked the Vietnam War, and don't think of it in terms of like heroic Americans coming in to save South Vietnam, which is the weird sort of narrative people get here. Or, Europeans will remember that when they were willing to pass sanctions and try to stop the Pretoria government from apartheid in South Africa, our political parties and our president went way, way out of their way to defend apartheid.
And so did Margaret Thatcher's Tories.
Right, yeah, but, we lose that completely because now we can look back and it's all like, yay, Mandela, and yay, equality, and it's all great. And we sort of forget that apartheid lasted a lot longer than it would have because we were willing to prop up the South African government. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot about our role in the world that we just sort of like miss.
Yeah. It's also the same kind of parallel to Israel. Israel would not have been able to continue doing what it's been doing to the Palestinian people without direct U.S. military, financial, economic, political support. Like
UN Security Council vetoes.
Yeah. And also, and the other thing too is also that we tend, going back to the whole, you're apologizing for communism angle, but like, even in large chunks of the global South, the Soviet Union's legacy is much more nuanced.
Mm-hmm. It is.
Even Cuba, like Cuban soldiers, Cuba, even large parts of South Africa, even Nelson Mandela gave credit to like Castro and like Cuban soldiers dying fighting South African soldiers preserving apartheid. Like
and Cuban soldiers and medics in Angola and participating in quite a few different places in the world where we tend to forget that Marxist-Leninism has a view in the U.S. where we look at it solely in terms of the dictatorships imposed in Eastern Europe and Russia, which, again, there's a certain privilege in only focusing there and ignoring the developing world, or the global South. And we forget that for most of the world, Marxist-Leninism was understood more as a philosophy of liberation, that huge parts of the anti-colonial struggles, the struggles for independence from colonialism, were inspired by socialism or directly supported by socialist movements. We want to ignore the fact that like Ho Chi Minh turned to the U.S. first and said, hey, will you help me get rid of the French? And we said, no, we're going to help the French maintain their colony. So, of course, he's going to align with the Soviets.
But Ho Chi Minh was already a socialist before. He was one of the founders of the French Communist Party. So
Sure, but that doesn't mean that he's immediately wanted to be part of like a Soviet orbit and create this sort of like, just monolithic, communist bloc that opposes America. That's what we kind of forget. America used to have a reputation of supporting liberation, of supporting freedom. People around the world took a great deal of inspiration. There's a great book I've got that actually looks at the direct influence of the American Declaration of Independence on other declarations around the world, and other people sort of like looking and saying, hey, this kind of call for the right to govern yourself seems like a cool idea. And then we just sort of miss that, especially post World War II, we kind of slipped into the position of the old European colonial powers. A lot of our military bases, our older military bases around the world, whether you're talking about the Indian Ocean or the Middle East or whatever, parts of East Africa, we just straight up took over British or French bases. We just moved right in and took over their role in the regions. And we forget that gives people in those areas a somewhat different take on our concept of freedom.
Yep. The other thing too is also the real. I think like the other thing too also, if you don't realize, like we're like again the quote unquote communist world was split because again you had the Sino-Soviet split, and the fact that China and the USSR both took separate positions on different things. I mean, that's where I will give like. I don't know how Vietnam was able to. This was in the middle of like when the Sino-Soviet split really kicked off. But the issue is like, pardon me, my roommates got locked out. I'll be right back.
Yeah, no worries.
Oh yeah. Whereas, but yeah, like the fact that like even like one of the more well-known go-to examples, again, I probably am butchering it, but Khmer Rouge, like Mao's China actually supported keeping the Khmer Rouge seat for Cambodia in the UN, while the USSR opposed it. And Vietnam fought, which is again an ML state, still a state ML run state, fought China on that and supported the Soviet line on that.
Yeah, and beyond that, there are quite a few experiments that have taken place that are sort of outside that framework. You look at the non-aligned Yugoslav experiment, where they traded with both sides throughout the entire time but refused to be part of the orbit. And then much of, and this is sort of problematic, but you used the term earlier, so it gives me an opportunity, I guess, to hit it. We still in the U.S. tend constantly to use this term third world when we're talking about the former colonized world, and it's not the same thing. It literally never was. Third world were non-aligned countries that didn't pick a side in the Cold War. And that's literally all it meant, was they didn't pick a side. So India wasn't a third world country because it was poor. It was a third world country because it bought shit from us and the Soviets.
And technically, this also included multiple political ideologies. You had, again, Tito's Yugoslavia. You had, again, like India, which still socialist leaning.
Yeah, it was sort of like left leaning, but again, not explicitly. It wanted to marry some of the ideals of like liberal democracy with socialist style economics.
Sukarno's Indonesia, which was again more right wing.
Yeah, exactly. Or really look at a lot of the different experiments you see across the developing world that continue to try and merge elements of it. It's sort of funny. You've mentioned before to me that you see a number of left-leaning people sort of comfortable with certain elements of Baathism. The old like Saddam's Iraq and the Assad's Syria. And that's always sort of struck me strangely because large parts of the whole Arab socialism angle that the Baathists and the Nasserists took was explicitly not socialist because it was married to a sense of nationalism. In many respects, what the Baathists are doing is a lot closer to fascism than it is to socialism, because it's married to the idea of a nation state, a particular set of people. But it does borrow elements from socialist economics, and it borrows some of the anti-imperialist language that a lot of like leftists will love. Oh yeah, you're bashing the old imperial powers. Oh, we love that. But you ignore the fact that the internal politics in Syria are a whole lot more like fascist Italy than they are, any kind of like actual socialist experiment.
But the issue, I would still disagree that one can't be a socialist and be a nationalist. For example, James Connolly, who was a Marxist and an Irish Republican. You have a lot of the IRA, during the 60s and 70s, were Marxist inspired. In fact, like a lot of the prisoners are reading Marx, literally Frantz Fanon, Ho Chi Minh, a lot of decolonial stuff.
Right.
They were nationalists. Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist and a socialist. Even Nasser, right. Who I think, frankly, on that, like, Arabs, if you're going to talk about, like, Baathism, like, I think Nasser, again, like, I will still call him a socialist. I think the notion that you can't be a nationalist and a socialist is a false dichotomy. It's just how your nationalism is placed and framed.
Yeah, I guess the quibble I would have there, because I do see a sharp distinction between nationalism and socialism. So even while you see tons of national liberation struggles drawing inspiration from socialism, so like the Irish, the Algerian, tons of other places where you're drawing direct inspiration from socialism while fighting a nationalist insurgency, I think where a number of those figures you can give them a free pass is because they still have an internationalist perspective. The goal of their struggle is not to create a kind of national hegemony for their own people and fuck the rest of the world, but to liberate peoples from any kind of outside imperial control and then work more cooperatively. You can still see this in the way that, for example, a ton of leftist Irish Republicans have historically supported, like, I don't know, the Palestinians.
The people, yeah.
Or, or like, anti-apartheid struggles, anything else. All kinds of areas where they've actually contributed.
Or like Cuba. Like, technically, like, Castro would be considered, he's an ML, but he's also a Cuban nationalist. And again, it was still a national liberation effort, but there still was framed in an internationalist framework.
Exactly. Why the hell are Cuban troops in Angola? What the hell does Angola have to do with Cuba? The issue is you're trying to liberate people. And I think we kind of forget that when we look at the more explicitly nationalist movements. This is where we really have to avoid the distinction there because, say, the German National Socialists were not socialist because they were explicitly nationalist first and borrowed elements of socialist economics, whereas in the cases we're talking about here, they're more holistically drawing in socialist ideals, and the idea is to liberate different peoples in order to build a kind of cooperative international framework.
Which I will still say, again, the issue isn't so much nationalism as a whole. It's, again, how it's framed, why you're using it, what's the end goal, for example. Like, what are you trying to do?
I guess. One of the things that just gets complicated is, and in so many cases it always falls back in this, it's a language issue. It's how we use words. What you end up there with is a much more nuanced understanding of it. So when we talk about leftist Irish nationalists, we're not really talking about nationalists in the sense of them saying Irish people are biologically and culturally superior to all other peoples and should crush the outsiders and no non-Irish people should live here, which is kind of what nationalism means. Strictly speaking, nationalism is a supremacy movement sort of rooted in chauvinism. But
also, too, like, sorry to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, but also, like, a lot of the decolonial movements were nationalistic, too.
They were.
I mean, some of them were definitely, I would still say, non-socialistic, but, like, nationalism has been a tool for colonized people to fight back. And that's
right.
where, like, I think you can't just dismiss nationalism completely, but you have to, again, I will say you can't compare black nationalism to white nationalism.
Right, and that, again,
no Quavins.
It just gets to a complication in the language because nationalism as an ideology is inherently problematic, but there's also a different type of nationalism. The nationalisms when we're looking at, and this gets really complicated for a lot of more black and white thinkers to hit, is, how can you excuse black nationalism and then say white power is bad? Well, the difference is that one arises in reaction to the other and is inherently aimed at a kind of liberation and then toward equality. So black nationalism is not trying to say black Americans are inherently superior and should enslave white Americans. It's trying to say black people are equal to white Americans, so black power, we want to be on the same level. And a lot of the anti-colonial nationalisms fall much more into that, especially the more socialist aligned ones. And again, everything from, Algeria to Ireland there, you've got these nationalist movements, but their nationalism is more about achieving independence and equality rather than imposing a sort of chauvinistic view. I mean, it's worth noting that the Algerian nationalists very bluntly and from the beginning said that we want an Algeria for all Algerians, whether you speak Arabic, Berber, or French, whether you are Muslim or Catholic, or Jewish. I mean, like they were trying to aim at a more open society. Now, it didn't turn out that way in any way, and that again gets to sort of the complicated circumstances. We talked before about how civil wars and violence and whatnot can totally poison an experiment. But their nationalism was not the sort of chauvinistic nationalism of, say, the Germans again, or Japanese nationalism, where, Japanese nationalists were like, yeah, the Chinese are biologically inferior and we can do medical experiments on them.
Yeah.
That's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah. And it's also goes back to show, going back earlier, how in the U.S. these terms get so muddled. Like, for example, I've known, I've had cousins that will call themselves, I'm a patriot and a nationalist. And it's like, technically, one is not the other always.
Yeah, and they're sometimes in conflict with one another too. Yeah.
And that's where it's, especially if especially if the term nation and state does get muddled too. It's especially here.
Yep. Nation, state, and country all get squished together. Nationalism and patriotism get squished together. And then, so to say nothing else, on the one hand, okay, patriotism, loving your country, nationalism, loving your nation, and nation and country are not the same thing, but we make them the same. That's, at least, we have two different words for it. It's even worse when we have multiple meanings for the same word. And you've got that with nationalism here. So you've got the sort of reactionary and chauvinistic nationalism that says my nation is superior to other nations and cannot coexist with them, versus the nationalism that says I want to be on the same footing as you. I don't want to be your inferior. It's sort of like a reaction to the situation that you're in that sort of says I want what you already have, but I don't want the kind of destructive power that you're using. I don't want the control you have exerted over me, over you. I just want to be your equal.
Yeah.
And here we're stuck using the same word for both because they're used that way, but they are distinct meanings.
Yeah. And that's the thing, especially with these issues of when you have a word that has multiple meanings, especially me, when I was, again, a libertarian, especially how these terms kind of get so muddled. There's libertarians here that will call themselves libertarians in the U.S. that are actually pretty fucking fascists. It's, and also you have libertarians that, again, you got the anarcho-capitalists. It's but it's, and especially, or even conservative, and that's where for me, where I think a lot of the transition for me going this hard left was I was never into tradition. And I think it's very hard. There's a lot of ways to distinguish the right from the left. And for me, a lot of it was, I was never conservative, in that sense. I never. Yeah,
exactly, the social conservative values. We forget that how much of the American libertarian movement was actually founded in, as a reaction to, as a response to the civil rights movement. That it came out of very, for lack of a better term, sort of traditional, traditional gender norms, traditional racial hierarchies, this sort of thing. They wanted things not to change. And when it looked like the government was going to impose, greater equality on people, they said, hell no.
Yep.
And it's sort of
and that's where,
covers it all up for us, yeah.
And that's where a lot of it's just for me, where a lot of the terms for me, one of the reasons why I think and that's where I know we've been talking about again, imperialism and U.S. involvement. That was again, one of the ways I think I was able to latch on and then move further left was because, and again, more contradiction. That's where again, say what you want about Mao, but I think his sort of how much he worked on contradictions I think, like, as a theoretical concept, really is more over in the American context in a lot of ways. Like how, and especially
Right.
given the fact that we are a settler nation, this sort of myth of like, oh, we built this. It's like this. No, you had to kill how many indigenous peoples here, and then import forced labor to develop your economy. The fact of the matter is that I don't know. This is somewhat of a different opinion. Like leftists in the U.S. have different opinions on it, but I think the fact that that's the primary contradiction is where, like, I think especially here and large on the world, here it's not ethnicity, it's race is the primary contradiction, and because it was inherently designed as a white supremacist economic political system. And
Right.
the fact of the matter is that I think it's a little bit issue how much you try to dance around the founding fathers when they all came from the same economic class. Like they were still relatively establishment figures, even for their time. They just wanted to change. That's where I think the big deal with liberalism is that it's the bourgeoisie wanted to take over, not they just want to remove like the traditional aristocratic king owner, like the monarchical system. And it's like, yeah, and the issue, the fact that matters that the U.S. forcibly expanded itself to ignore treaties of indigenous peoples, waged wars of, again, genocide, and essentially also, because again, like I would say, like the U.S. involvement out in, like, again, Latin America, Asia, Africa, is a natural extension of of Manifest Destiny, basically conquering all the way up to the Pacific.
Yeah. Yeah. The actual lack of radicalism in the American Revolution is an interesting one, I think, for a lot of people. We can more easily see in the Latin American uprisings that it was clearly just the local Criollo population wanting the power for themselves and wanting to push out the Peninsulares. You know, they didn't want to change the social structure at all. They didn't care about how racist or exploitative the system was. They didn't care about all the poor people there. They weren't trying to expand democracy to people. They just wanted to change who was in charge. And we tend to forget that the U.S. approach before it was actually more like that than it was like, say, the French Revolution. In that what we had was we wanted to push out the previous elite and replace it with a new elite. And we created an explicitly elitist document. And one of the things underpinning that was white supremacy.
Yep.
And I think that, again, gets into this question of nuance that's so complicated for people, because as soon as you bring that up, and you get this a lot with conservatives freaking out about the whole, like, 1619 project or whatever, that they're like, oh my God, you can't talk about how racism has defined this country from the start. I'm like, well, it kind of has. I mean, people like our founding fathers are not perfect figures. There's no black and white view. We can say Washington and Jefferson are genuinely good people in many ways, with some genuinely progressive or liberal ideas. You know, there's a lot to cheer about both of them, but there's no way around the fact that both of them were explicit white supremacists too.
But
and that contradiction is sort of built in.
Yeah, but the other thing too, I would also say on top of that, though, like, it's easy to make that kind of like, oh, there's some good to be taken from them. If you, again, like, I'm gonna be straight up, we're both white dudes. Like, it's very, and that's where, again, a lot of other, like, black and brown people here will say, you know what, you have the privilege to make that argument. You have the
Right.
privilege to say that.
Exactly.
And you know what, I will say, it's not my place to tell them that. If they like fuck Washington, fuck Jefferson all the way, and you know what, hey, look at
I feel you.
Yeah, and that's where, like, I think, like, the issue is the other problem of nuance. It's like
And a problem of privilege. And it gets to another real question there of experiments. So the U.S. move, like the French and, like the Latin American ones, like so many others, they're flawed experiments that, from me, I have the sort of privilege of being, this, I don't know, semi-bougie white historian type to kind of like look at each of these different flawed attempts to advance a general trend toward greater liberation. But when something is baked in white supremacist genocidal from the start. You know, I mean, if you're coming from an indigenous or African perspective on the founding of this country, it's a lot harder to see the good in the experiment, you know? And to some degree, it becomes like the difficulty of seeing, you know, the good or bad in anything else. You know, when we end up with, because we tend to reflect our own context. I mean, how many Americans really struggle to acknowledge any of the good that came out of the Soviet experiment? I mean, I don't know. They created the LEDs that are on all our smartphones, you know? I mean, they kicked our butts in large parts of the space race. They you know, contributed a lot to our current global civilization, but they were also a vicious dictatorship. So we have to say Soviet bad, and that's that. And we're not able to take a look at it.
Yep.
There's a certain difficulty of seeing the nuances that are true for people in general. And it doesn't matter, you know, where you are, you know, what position you're in, privileged or not privileged. We always have a tendency to be trapped within a particular paradigm, within a particular discursive framework. And we have a hard time seeing sort of beyond that, I guess.
Yep.
And really that these are all badly flawed experiments. You know, the Soviet Union was a badly flawed experiment, but we got to be honest here, so was the United States. And that doesn't mean I don't like my country. That means I'm going to acknowledge that it created an elitist constitution founded on genocide and white nationalism. And it was only slowly and forcibly democratized. And is still less democratic than a lot of the developed world.
I mean, here's the other thing. The thing too, is it fair? And that goes back to the point. What is democracy?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where, like, I think, how do I say it? This is where, like, I think the notion of, like, again, dictatorship, or like, it's like, for a lot of people, I mean, how democratic is the United States really? I would say,
it's essentially an oligarchy.
Yeah, and that for me, the issue is where, like, as someone, again, that's, again, a socialist and an anti-imperialist, it's like, again, I could have my critiques or my concerns about whatever, and also the USSR is gone. USSR is dead. These whatever revolutions up until are dead. Also, they're not that kind of discussion and sort of, and I think too many leftists, even here in the U.S., tend to focus on, whatever, the Spanish Civil War, for example, or Mako versus Trotsky in the Russian Civil War. It's like, no, focus inward. Mm-hmm. If you call yourself, you want to help the Palestinian people, you want to national liberation efforts, you want to help the socialist cause around the world, you got to focus on, frankly, again, smashing the imperial core here. You're in the heart of the belly of the beast. And for me, it's like, nothing wrong with catching up with what's going around the world, but it's also like, I can't, nothing I will ever do will affect what happens. I can donate money, I can, like, boost on social, whatever. But I can only do so much as a citizen in the imperial core, helping the periphery.
Mm-hmm.
It's my job to help them to smash the core here. And that's where, like, again, like, for me, at the end of the day, while I have my critiques, concerns, I'm not going to just, again, I keep saying shit on these projects around the world, but it's also like, a lot of the good chance why they're struggling in these projects is because of my country's political involvement.
Yeah, and that's hard for people to deal with as well, because it looks like you're somehow attacking your own country or whatever. I run into this a lot with people. They're like, well, you've got all these critiques of the U.S. Why don't you just move? Why don't you just go somewhere else? I'm like, well, you're kind of missing the point. The point is, I live here. I don't live somewhere else. And what I want is to democratize my own backyard. I want to improve the situation here. And, you know, there's so many different ways to do that. This is one of the reasons that I enjoy studying a lot of these different movements, whether they are more evolutionary projects, like you have in, say, like, I don't know, Britain or the U.S., or much more explicitly revolutionary projects, like in, you know, France or Russia, you know, where you're trying to change a status quo and increase democracy. We forget that the Soviets were trying to democratize Russia. They were living in an absolute monarchy. Did they create a democracy? No. But by at least dealing with a lot of the resource concentration, it was much more democratic than it was before, And that, again, it gets complicated for people because if we acknowledge that life for the average citizen in the Russian Empire improved under the Soviets, then it sounds like you're cheering on every part of their project and you lose all nuance.
Yeah.
But all you're doing is you're acknowledging a simple fact. I mean, life was not good in Tsarist Russia. This doesn't mean that there weren't other ways to accomplish the same goal, that it didn't have to go exactly the same way, but there were improvements made, and they did have that same goal of liberation. And I think that that's something we have in common all around the world. There's people in various movements all over the place that there is a certain commonality, and we tend to miss that. I don't know, to sort of get back to this theme of change or transformation, I think one of the things that stands out in your story for me is that there was already it was already an issue of freedom that drove you more into it, where you mentioned that for many people, identification with libertarian thought is more a matter of social conservatism, of preserving a kind of status quo against a world that seems like it's changing too fast. So you want to weaken the government because the government is imposing changes that you don't want.
Yeah. And a lot of it's also the sort of hyper individualism, which I think even amongst the West, the US Americans, again, when I say Americans, I'm just as a catch-all, but tends to be more overt than even in Europe, Australia, for example, Canada, this hyper individualism, which still manifests in liberals here, for example. You still see if you're in the belly of the beast, if you're in the US, doesn't matter, even if you are a socialist, some of that will bleed into you. You're still going to have that cultural upbringing, and it's going to take years, if maybe you're never going to be able to fully get rid of everything. And that's where and that's again where the issue is again, if you're in here, you are going to, in the belly of the beast, you're going to absorb a lot of it. And and speaking of the issue for me especially was a lot of the libertarian, especially the fact that for people, a lot of types that value individual freedom, for example, that sort of framework, there still was what I noticed, a lot of them kind of became really dogmatic and just reactionary when you're you know what, maybe having a state is not a bad thing. Or you know what, maybe I think some kind of regulation is okay. That there's kind of this almost reactionary aspect to it, and as well as
right, it gets very knee-jerk. There's again no ability to look at nuance.
Yeah.
So even if you're talking about I don't know, let's take more a syndicalist or confederationalist model, where you're looking, it's highly decentralized, lots of local direct democracy, tons of individual freedom there, but you still need to work together collaboratively on big projects, big environmental things, for example. How do you tackle global warming if every single village is a completely separate country, But as soon as you start to talk about any kind of collaboration, any kind of confederation, you have, in essence, recreated a kind of state.
Yeah, it's also,
and if the state itself is the sole bad, then you've got a problem.
And that's where one of my biggest critiques, I think of a lot of anarchists, is that while again, capitalism in many ways, it's even before what we would call the state, still existed before. You still saw elements of it, and I also think the fact that even a lot of liberal or centrist political theorists can't agree on what the state is. And that's where, for me, I think fixate, and also, more for libertarians in the U.S. context, they ignore the role that corporation or capital does.
Right.
I just think focusing on the state as the measure of all things bad or good, if no one can even agree on what it is, it's not a good form of analysis. I'm also even anarchistic projects or libertarian socialist projects have, on the surface level, state-like structures. Are they necessarily a nation state? No. Are they maybe centralized, no, but how
Exactly,
they,
but there's something akin to it, yeah, and people can get very absolutist on that and toss the nuance there. Anarchism is not opposed to order, it's opposed to hierarchical control. And I think that's one of the problems with the libertarian right, that the libertarian left doesn't share. And I'll come back around in a second and kind of like, I'll also shit on my own side there. But there's a set of blinders that we have where on the libertarian right, you don't see that the point is liberation. That if you focus only on weakening the state or dismantling the state without dismantling power structures, then all that happens is an immediate recreation of the state. We miss something that I teach in some of my ancient history lessons, where you can, well, where did the state come from? Well, the state emerged out of private property claims, as a way to protect private property claims. If you're going to avoid social conflict in a population of 20,000 people, how do I stop them from killing each other if they all have property? What's to stop me from, I don't know, bumping off Conor and taking his land? I like his land more. I'm going to take it. Well, you've got to find some way to structure society, to impose a kind of law. Property reconstitutes political authority. You could wipe out the state immediately. If the ANCAPs got what they wanted, we would immediately create a state the very next day because the rich want one. They need also, one.
Yeah. And the fact of the matter is, the ultra wealthy are going to be able to, private security forces. It's basically turning into neo-feudalism.
Exactly. A private security force is still a police or army. I mean, all you're doing is creating a new kind of state. Initially, it's a slightly more decentralized state, but what you've done is created a kind of like neo-manorialism, sort of like in feudal Europe, where it's sort of like decentralized petty tyrannies. And then over time, what would happen is those petty tyrannies start to collaborate more, and then you start that whole process of centralization. I mean, the rich will create states to protect themselves because they need a state to protect themselves from the majority. They need a state to protect themselves from us.
Yeah, and the one thing I will say, like one of my biggest, again, like the issue too is also to where I think especially with some strains of anarchism, especially here, I think highly individualistic forms of anarchism are actually pointless in my opinion, or especially a lot of post-left, or a lot of stuff that came out France, especially after 1968, the uprising there. It's what are you building? It doesn't. If you smash the state, for example, or you smash the capitalist state, but are you really actually trying to actually build a better life for everyone?
Is there a plan? And I think that's a question that a lot of people who get involved in these movements, especially ones that are geared more toward revolutionary change as opposed to evolutionary changes, you got to wonder, what is your plan even? How do you see this playing out? You focus so much on the immediate goals and the immediate enemies, and you don't think about where you're going. Yeah. I think that's another thing that we miss sometimes too on the libertarian left. I think I take nuance to a kind of extreme, or gray areas to extreme. I like to shit on my own side too. I think a lot of us forget that markets and capitalism are not the same thing. We have a tendency when we think of capitalism to link together all forms of commerce and business ownership, and that's not it. Capitalism is a specific financial instrument that concentrates, private wealth for investment purposes. Capitalism isn't opening up a bodega that you run with your family and making money there. Capitalism isn't trading with the next village over and selling all my extra tomatoes for, your woodworking or something. Commerce we've had for thousands and thousands of years. Capitalism is 5 centuries old.
Yeah, and the other thing too, it's a man. Who is it meant to serve? Is the issue.
Yeah, exactly. And if you're thinking in terms of improving the situation for your own family, improving your own lives, I mean, it's a little harder to. I mean, I guess people have a tendency on the libertarian left to say that there is no value at all in commerce. Well, then that gives you a real problem. And this is one of the reasons that so many previous socialist experiments have become authoritarian, is that what people end up doing is leaning on some kind of bureaucracy to move the stuff around, because without markets, how the hell do you get the goods from one place to the next?
It's also there's the issue I find is health, or even more complicated structures, like healthcare, education,
Yeah, a basic insurance framework, yeah.
I mean, and absolutely, these structure healthcare can be a precedent in its own way. Just ask the mental health care system in this country. But it's
Yeah.
again the issue I find is like it's where like in many ways I respect again like a lot of like libertarian socialist projects. Again, like okay, like while I have my critiques, Rojava or the EZLN in Chiapas, or even like the Spanish anarchists in Spain, like they were trying, they weren't how to say it compared to like a lot of like anarchists, especially now in the West, trying to build something. Like there was, and the fact that again, you also
An
like,
attempt was made.
and that's where like I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. And it's like the fact of the matter is, that, okay, let's say, especially how much burnout also comes in play, and also how much a lot of the white supremacist culture still infects so many of leftist spaces here in the U.S. And I mean, even like the Black Panther Party, massive issues with patriarchy within the party itself that,
Yep.
yeah, not that non-men comrades there brought up, as well as like the fact that there still is a lot of like, even within the, and this is not even a tendency thing, it's a cultural issue. Like, you anarchists absolutely still perpetuate white supremacist and patriarchal shit as much as MLs do.
Yeah, and again, largely because
you-
these are deeper structures that are kind of embedded in our culture, in our social structures. They're just a part of the world in which you grow up, and
Yeah.
simply adopting a new economic philosophy doesn't change where you're coming from. There still is a need to slowly dismantle a lot of those. I mean, this is where the Soviets markedly failed in a number of ways. They tried to break down some of the nationalistic elements and the sexist elements, and to say, hey, women can get jobs and, go to space or whatever there. But it stayed a pretty deeply racist and sexist country. I mean, anti-Semitism didn't disappear in the Soviets because they tried to, implement a socialist system, even though philosophically they were opposed to it. They still reproduced the same conditions that they grew up in.
And that's where I will say a lot of that is not some like again like some other tendencies try to say that that's inherent in MLs again will always end up becoming reactionary. It's like no, I mean yeah, like some MLs are frankly, especially online, are reactionary as hell. But it's also like is that necessarily the fault of the ideology, the philosophy, the economics?
Right, exactly.
Well, there's the underlying culture. Like again, socialism has to be reflect the material conditions of where it's at. Like socialism will never be the same in China, Japan, India, here, UK, Luxembourg. Like it's, and that's where
I mean, because there are cultures, there is a pre-existing history. There are, there's all kinds of structures into which you're born. We actually forget that, a lot of Stalin's most dickish moves came from the fact not that he was a socialist, but because he was actually a social conservative.
Yep.
That he was himself, by nature, a bit more reactionary and conservative, but he happened also to be a socialist.
Yep.
And they are like distinct layers in our heads. We're all like carrying these nested contradictions.
Yep. And also like the fact of the matter is the heavily anti-religious angle of the Soviet Union basically indirectly led to the rise of, especially in Chechnya and like a lot of like the Caucasus regions, like the fact that the Soviet state clamped down on Islam, on Christianity, like it's
created an Islamist reaction. Yep.
Yeah, which
you see the same thing in a lot of the Arab totalitarian states. Why do places like Turkey and Algeria and Egypt and whatnot have a real problem with reactionary Islamists? Because they made a lot of it illegal, because they clamped down on it, because they kept putting preachers in jail, so it radicalizes people.
Yeah, I mean that's a good thing too, where like I think explains like okay, for example, why would the DRPK turn out the way it did, or like a lot, and again a lot of the issues like I find, say what you want about authoritarian regimes, dictatorships, whatever. They have a justified reason to stay in power if they're being externally threatened, crushed, quashed, economically, politically, militarily.
Right.
Like, no offense, doesn't mean it's a good idea, but I can't blame the DRPK for wanting nukes.
Yeah, honestly, I have the same kind of problem.
And Iran, and it's also
I have a hard time understanding, like, okay, we're really wigged out about the Iranians developing a nuclear weapon, but we've also been explicitly antagonistic toward them for how long?
yeah.
I mean, yeah, do I want DPRK to have a nuclear weapon pointed at Seoul? Oh, hell no. But they also are surrounded by foreign military bases and constant antagonism, and states have a tendency to want to survive. This doesn't mean I like the DPRK government any more than I like the Islamic Republic of Iran. I tend to like the Iranian people. I tend to think that there's a lot there, but it bothers me that we have this weird double standard where we... I don't know. It gets back to the whole, like, I don't know. Think about the discourse around Israel has a right to defend itself. Okay, well, do Palestinians? No, because we like Israel. Well, then what does that right even mean? It's the same thing with, like, Iran. I mean, does Iran have a right to defend itself? Well, no, because we don't like their government. So they can't have weapons, but Israel can have nukes. It's totally fine.
Yeah, and here's, like, the weird thing where, like, I get a lot of... It's like, wait, you're a Marxist, and yet you okay with Iran as it is existing. It's like, yeah, like, I have no right to... I mean, yeah, doesn't mean I want their government, but no. Why should I want the Iran to be wiped out? Like, it's weird. It's like, there's this almost, like, inherent need to find a gotcha kind of moment with, like, especially in the U.S. And it's like, no, it doesn't mean I support having the same government model. No. Also, it was even when the 79 revolution, the fact that it wasn't, nobody knew it was going to turn into what it did.
Right.
And it's also like, yeah, like, and there's also this weird thing to where, like, I kind of have some quipes about, like, oh, you support the state, you can oppose the state, not the people, and support the people, where it's like, technically, yeah, you're right, but it's also like, you wipe out the Iranian state, is that going to help out the Iranian people?
Ordinary people are going to suffer. Yeah, we forget that sanctions hurt ordinary people. They tend not to hurt elites.
There's also this weird thing, too, where it's like this critique that, like, again, against some MLs, is like, wait, how could you support BDS for the Palestinian people but oppose sanctions in Venezuela? It's like, you're falsely equivalent the scenarios. One, name me again, maybe you would know better, but is there any significant state supporting BDS?
Government?
Yeah.
No.
Also,
there are movements in a few different countries agitating for it, but no, not really. I mean, outside, of course, of the Muslim world, which frequently has been BDS from the very start.
Yeah, and also even a lot of it's kind of changing too with the governments in some of those regions, those countries.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, there was a kind of, like, disconnect for a while where they just pretended it wasn't there. We tend to forget too that, I don't know, you get somebody like, somebody in Iran saying, like, Israel should be wiped off the map. Like, well, that doesn't mean, like, they want to nuke them. That just means they still don't recognize that there's a government there, and they want, a Palestine or whatever. It's not often as simple as we tend to put things.
And it's also like, and that's where, again, I think you can't, I mean, again, you feel free to chime in, but, like, I think you cannot equivalent, it's absolutely consistent politically and ideologically, economically, to support BDS for the Palestinian people and be like, no sanctions on the DRPK, no sanctions on Syria, no sanctions on Venezuela.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, because at the end of the day, I do have a real problem with sanctions in that they directly hurt ordinary people. There are plenty of ordinary Israelis and Israeli Arabs who would be harmed by sanctions placed on the state of Israel. At the same time, sometimes sanctions have had a positive effect, like, cutting off the South African economy did actually lead to the fall of apartheid. Yeah. However, it also deeply harmed the overall economy, which hurt a lot of poorer people in South Africa, and you still have a tremendous amount of poverty there that might not have been the case if you'd had a kind of transition that didn't.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that
it's hard to know.
The fact that, like, and it's also like, especially even like a lot of, like, individuals in these countries, again, will have massively different opinions. Like, like, I was reading some stories about, like, again, Syrian refugees. Again, like, wow, it's almost like entire peoples are not going to be unified ideologically. It's like, especially how we frame, like, the Kurds, for example. It's like, no, there's
a lot of factions. Yeah.
Yeah, same thing. But like they're interviewing these Syrian refugees, and they're like, yeah, I just want to go home. Assad's still in power, but I just want to go home.
Yeah.
Like it's for me, it's like, and that's where for me it's so easy for us to like just, and it's like, and that's where again I have a real conflict with Syria, especially. It's like I will still say the U.S. should never have gotten involved in the first place,
Right.
and the fact of the matter is that, but I still don't like, and the fact that I do think some on my own side are celebrating Assad is, I will admit, is uncomfortable. But I'm also will say that at this current state in the game, removing him is one, neither going to happen anytime soon, and two, it's not going to make the situation in Syria better. It's
Right. And this is where, again, I think that we would be better served in a lot of our political dialogues, across, different aisles or whatever, when we get to talking to people, is if we could introduce a little bit more nuance, understand that there are gray areas and that multiple and conflicting ideals can coexist in your head. And we've hit quite a few of them here. Okay, so I am neither for BDS nor against it because I see arguments one way or the other, so I simply don't have a position on it. I don't see that. I can understand that it would be harmful, but I can also see places where sanctions have worked out right, and I don't see that I need to take a hard stand on that one. But there are places where, I don't know, it gets even weirder. Like, we're talking about... Okay, so we talked about Iran a bit ago, right? I intensely dislike the Islamic Republic government, right? Does that mean I want it overthrown? No, because ultimately it's none of my fucking business. That's up to the Iranian people. I will cheer on the Iranian people doing whatever the hell they wanted. I'm fine cheering on the initial Iranian revolution because, there was no way to know the Khomeinis were going to seize power. There were liberals, leftists, different ethnic militant groups. Yeah, the two-day was essentially Marxist in many ways. Yeah, there's all kinds of groups that were involved there. It wasn't necessarily going to be Khomeinist. The same thing with the Green Revolution, in various attempts since then to try and democratize the state more. I'm totally happy to see things like that happen. What I don't want is some kind of outside attack, because what that does is it uses a lot of the inherent biases that we already have. And I think that's what comes in a lot of people's critiques of it. When somebody's asking you, well, how can you not want to hate on the Iranian government or something? Well, what that is really reflecting is these longer term cultural trends that raise us to be prejudiced towards other people and to think in a kind of neo-imperialist fashion. The fact that the United States imposed a dictatorship in 1953 and then has been pissed ever since 1979 because they overthrew our pet dictator, that we've tried to isolate this country ever since, that you grow up sort of surrounded by hating on Iran, and then you don't see that there is a kind of human complexity there, that not all Iranians are responsible for their own government, and in fact many Iranians hate their own government. And actively would want to change it. It's really, at the end of the day, not our place to sort of impose our vision of things. And it gets us back to this sense that on some level, we're all experimenting. Everything has been an experiment so far. Socialism and capitalism, liberal democracy, and all kinds of various governing forms are all attempts to produce a system that we like. And I think that people have an inherent right to resist the government that they're under and try to improve upon it. But we don't have the right to impose our history and our choices and what worked for us on somebody else. I think that people have to find those balances themselves. They have to experiment themselves. At the end of the day, everyone has a different history. And that means that they have some different culture and some different experiences and everything else that's going to affect the way they want to conceive of a government. So the outcome might not look exactly like I would prefer. But, ultimately it doesn't matter, I never liked the idea of anybody living under any kind of dictatorship. I am, by default, I veer toward direct democracy. I want individual freedoms for people and our choice on things. So no dictatorship makes me happy. At the same time, I opposed the Cold War 100% because it's not our frickin' problem. I mean, it's not our choice how people in East Germany lived. It's their choice how they lived. They have the right to alter that social contract and alter that government in the same way that, honestly, when people created this country or any other, or the French Revolution, why are we okay cheering on the liberal outcome of the French Revolution, the American Revolution, everything else, but we deny that freedom to everyone else? We deny, there's a kind of almost like, I don't know, ethnic chauvinism or racism involved there in basically saying, well, everybody from like the Russians to the Chinese to sub-Saharan Africans to no one else has the right to experiment. Everyone else needs what we think they should have.
The other issue too is also that, and that's where like I would say like the issue especially is that, sorry, I was gonna lost my train of thought for a second, but it's the issue to where like, again, like why I mean was I am a Marxist is that why like in many ways like I have my again why, for example, in Peru, Castillo versus Fujimori. I'm sorry, Fujimori's daughter, the guy that literally fucking committed how many sterilizations of indigenous women in Peru. Fujimori executed activists like her dad was a fucking war criminal.
Yeah,
he deserved it. And Castillo though is his party is technically, I mean, I'm butchering the language probably, so forgive me. And it's like, but like I will still say, and given the fact that I think he is the best option. Like, yeah, his party's Big Ten. Like, he does have some anti-imperialist, some like Marxist-Leninist kind of overt, some elements of like, forgot his name, the Peruvian Marxist, but like I forgot the name off the top of my head. But like, I do have some gripes. I do think that, especially in like historically, like, a lot of like Latin American leftist reformers tend to get offed pretty quickly. And I think the fact of the matter is maybe he does need to, again, my own personal critique, purge the Fujimorists because they will try to do something. It's the same thing you saw like in Venezuela, in Bolivia, Brazil. It's just Chile.
Yeah, it's tough because, and honestly, it brings back up the same debates that you saw in the Soviets in the first place. If you don't, purge the reactionaries, so to speak, they're going to just, oppose it and they're going to like overthrow it, and then the revolution never gets anywhere. But then you end up with this whole problem that you're poisoning the new plant right after you put it in the soil. So, by when Lenin, created the Cheka, he was basically just reconstituting the Tsarist secret police. And at that point then, is what he's doing any better? It gets a lot harder for me to support things like that. I can see the logic of trying to head off that sort of opposition that would inevitably show up, that people would want to get rid of these experiments. Yep. By the same token, as soon as you engage in those tactics, you're handing ammunition to them to justify overthrowing your experiment because you're basically corrupting it from the start.
I mean, but the issue too, it's also easy to make those decisions in the comfort of our libraries.
Right, exactly. I have the privilege of evaluating these things all after the fact, and
the fact of the matter is that even the anarchist Ukraine had a intelligence service.
Yep.
It's like, and that's where again I have such a critique of the authoritarian leftists. It's like if you're in an active war zone, your existential threat, if you don't clamp down, you're wiped out. Like that's just how, and that's where again it's especially when again you have mass starvation, war. And this is where I'm very, very. It's ironic. Like again, people give me stuff. It's like, Connor, you're a military history geek, but you're very much anti-war. I'm like, yes, because war, it doesn't matter what side. There's only the lesser evil in a war, and it's like every side, no matter how justified or how moral defensive it is, will commit war crimes. They're inevitable.
War is hell. Yeah, it's always going to. It's problematic, and ultimately there's so many ways in which that comes up. I mean, I don't know, like no matter how liberal the state is still somehow corrupted by the amount of power that it has, or any kind of concentrated power is going to lead to abuses. War,
And
I think,
even
is one of the best examples of that.
and even like libertarian leftists will do the same. If it's survival, it's also like the issue too. I will also say that despite, I'm also going to say this, like in Vietnam, did the Vietnamese people captured American POWs? Did they capture ARVN troops and did some fucked up shit? I'm like, yeah. I'm also not going to equate that to what the United States has done to that country as a whole. That whole thing would never have happened without the American involvement. And for me, it's like, and that's the issue too, I find, especially with like wars like this. It's like, especially how like far right assholes try to equate Dresden with like what the Germans were doing. Yeah, recognize where bad shit happened again, but also you cannot equivalent it to the wider picture. I mean, clearly,
Right, exactly. There's always this weird equivalency that comes up. It's one of the reasons that, I will often step in and try to point out that the numbers we use, say, for Stalin's crimes are massively exaggerated. And then there's a political angle to doing that. But it doesn't mean I'm in any way justifying them. It's simply that, wow, Stalin was horrific. Hitler was still worse. There's just no way around that. He still killed a lot more people.
And I will still say this. I would rather be under I would much rather be under Soviet rule than Nazi rule. I'm just saying, like, especially like given how much the race element was so core to Nazi ideology.
Right.
And I mean, like, technically, I forgot much of the numerology, but like, again, me being of Irish descent, the Soviets wouldn't give a fuck. The Nazis would give a fuck. Like, they would definitely rank us lower down that scale. I mean, we're close to Slavic people, for example, but still, my place in society is already decided because they're operating from a race-based angle. And if the Nazis actually got that far, there's no fucking way they would not start doing that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as as someone who doesn't really have that Germanic ancestry, really, I mean, I'm primarily Slavic, Mediterranean, and Celtic. I don't fit their nice little racial utopia.
And that's where I will say, like, yeah, the Soviet Union was not perfect by any means, but compared to Nazi Germany, there's no fucking comparison. And that's where, like, I think and like I also get it where, like, especially if your family members were harmed by the Soviet Union,
I get that.
And it gets harder than that, but it's also like, and that's where, like, I think it's so easy. It's where, like, I just say, like, oh, fuck the USSR makes about as much sense to me as, like, the USSR was the best thing for socialism. It's like, I do think the fall of the USSR did a lot of damage to a lot of socialist projects, but and that's where, at the end of the day, I just feel like it doesn't. That's where nuance has to be admitted.
Right, and I would put that onto both sides too, because you've got on the one hand the sort of chauvinistic right saying America can do no wrong, and rah rah America and we're perfect, and then at the other side there's a tendency often on the left to kind of like be like, well, fuck America, we're just this genocidal racist state and nothing good ever happened here. And there is a more nuanced view of that where you can acknowledge the horrific evils that we created and also acknowledge the bold experiments that did actually contribute in some way positively to the world. It's similar to being able to acknowledge some of the good that the Bolsheviks were trying to do while still acknowledging the evil that they unleash. That it is an inherently gray picture. And I think that gets to this whole question of shifting views, really. I mean, because there's honestly two major parts to it, because we all start with some predispositions, but we all are shaped far more by the environment that we're in and what we're around, and certain discourses that we fall into, so there's certain ways that you kind of grow up hearing and learning certain ways of viewing something. And in our political circles, we tend not to get outside of those bubbles. We tend to stay inside nice, safe little areas. You know, libertarians hang out with libertarians, liberals hang out with liberals, conservatives hang out with conservatives, and you're hearing the same kind of stuff, which is always like validating you. You know, it's essentially like reinforcing where you already are rather than challenging you.
Yeah. And that's where the issue too that I found is that, like, surprisingly, I mean, how do I say it? Like, for example, for me, like a lot of it was just, I remember, like, when I was still libertarian, like, also I will say it's a myth that, oh, you become more conservative when you start working, get out of college. No. I will admit, I was still a libertarian up until I graduated college. Like, I only did not shift that far left until, I mean, you started seeing trickles of it, for me at least, like, especially at the Trump era, because that's where a lot of it just started for me going downhill. But, like, yeah, and I think, and that's where, like, it really, because especially, I remember, like, when I was kind of turning into, like, a quasi-liberal, like, I would say, like, maybe, like, a European-style liberal. So, like, I was, like, posting articles, like, about, oh, Medicare for all is a good thing, or, like, and I was getting, like, lit up in the comment section, like, fucking communist, and but I was getting, like, people messaging me privately, like, people working for libertarian think tanks, working in that world, like thanking me almost for, like, admitting that, yeah, I think a public welfare system, public funded healthcare is okay. Like, I'm like, damn, are people, for suppose, like, free speech warriors who are, like, pissed off about cancel culture, they sure don't like diverging opinions regarding economics. Like, it's, and also for me especially, it was like, especially where, like, a lot of, like, libertarian, you know, a lot of them would call themselves liberty conservatives. Like, these terms are weird, if I'm being honest, but, like, it was like, right, the fact that so many so-called freedom-loving individual liberty were, like, pissed off that, like, we're kind of, like, getting pissed off about, like, oh, people being allowed to use which bathroom fit their gender identity. I'm like,
right. I mean, the people who are talking about freedom are the same ones making jokes about throwing commies out of helicopters.
Yeah. And it's like, for me, it's like, wait, bro, have you ever been to a metal show? I've had to piss and go in the women's bathroom because the line's shorter and nobody cares. Like, it's a lot of this weird dynamic, and for me especially, where, like, I was never, also, like, immigration. Surprisingly, like, a lot of right-wing libertarians were like, because they framed it as you wouldn't let people come into your house, right? So it's like they framed it as a private property argument. I'm like, technically, your own economic thinkers think, I mean, it's like the words of Frederick Bastiat, one of the biggest right-wing ideologues, is like, if goods and people don't cross borders, soldiers will. And it's like, wait, technically, if you're a free market capitalist, you should not want borders. Like,
right. Exactly. I mean, it really just there should be a free movement, not only of goods and services, but also labor. You know, if you're really for, like, free markets, then people should be able to go wherever they want. So what you're really getting is a kind of knee-jerk nationalism. This is where we have that the kind of, like, libertarian to fascist pipeline. You know, there's a kind of like,
yeah, which I've seen firsthand. I mean, I remember also too, like, for me especially, was when Milo Yiannopoulos was relevant. I mean, thank God he's no longer relevant, but, like,
yes,
I remember there was serious debate. I'm like, people were pissing on me because I'm like, maybe libertarian student groups should not, and I was someone that was a chapter president, a state chair for Young Americans for Liberty. I did campaign work. I was out to DC for convention. Like, I was really into it. I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't think Milo Yiannopoulos should be, because what, you're just about owning the libs, and, like, he's not even a libertarian. He was not even a libertarian. He said so himself. Right. But because it became so much about, like, fuck these college liberals, and it's like, it's not an ideology at that point. Like, you're not even, like, trying to spread your ideas. You're just, especially how much turning point U.S. Oh my God. Even
it just becomes a response. You know, there's this weird kind of reactionary element to it, where all you're doing is trying to, like, score points, or becomes a kind of team issue where you wipe out any possible nuance or gray area in anything, just because they're on the other side, therefore fuck them,
Yeah.
even if in ideological terms you should kind of align with them more. I don't know. I saw that a lot with the Bernie campaign in particular. So if you like lay out on a political compass, Bernie was a hell of a lot more libertarian, than pretty much anybody who's run. I mean, he's much less authoritarian. I mean, it's really rare to find politicians at all that are below that line. And it didn't matter. Tons of people on the libertarian right could not give him any credit at all. They still wanted to see him as kind of like a closet Stalinist, because they disagree with him on the economics, and it became like about of scoring points and owning the libs or whatever. There, you had to completely ignore his anti-war record, his support for gay marriage, his support for the drug issues, his support for gun rights and everything else. You just wipe all that stuff out because he's on the other team.
And a lot of it also for me, it's like, especially when Trump, like how to say it, like people's true colors came out when Trump. I remember this really is what started for me. I was at a Young Americans Liberty convention. It was my last one. I believe, I'm trying to remember the year. I think it would have been 15 or 16. It's been, but I remember there was 300 some college libertarians there. And I just remember half the room standing up oh my God, it was like watching fucking Nazi propaganda, screaming, build the wall, build the wall.
Oh,
and I was like,
what?
And I was sitting there, and a bunch of us were sitting there, because you see all these people standing up, and I wouldn't be surprised, whatever, group psychology people just stood up too, but I'm sitting there what the fuck is going on? What? And a lot of that, and for me, especially what also made it for me, the French presidential elections, I don't know why, but so many people I knew that were right-wing libertarians or conservatives supported fucking Marie Le Pen over. I mean, frankly, it's stupid for us even get supported because French party politics is weird in itself. But I'm right. Technically speaking, if you think libertarianism is an economic philosophy first and foremost, Macron's your better bet. He's a liberal, but
exactly. Macron was a neoliberal, and Marine Le Pen is basically a fascist. I mean, she took a lot of really economically centrist positions, but she was a nationalist, and that again, there's that conservatism that comes in.
Yeah, and I'm what the and the fact that so many, I'm a lot, and essentially that kind of contradiction for me just kind of got worse and worse.
Mm-hmm.
And also, especially seeing how many former compatriots of mine, for lack of a better word, became. Wow, I look like I'm turning to it now. I'm gonna put the lights on, but I'm gonna keep talking.
Yeah, I was gonna suggest that.
Is that better?
Not much.
Yeah, my apartment's
but it's a little.
But essentially, what happened was, that happened. Especially I've actually seen the libertarian alt-right pipeline firsthand. I've seen people I've collaborated, quote unquote, in the same organization become full-blown Holocaust deniers. And for me, it's the fact that people were still in our spaces, just you're all concerned about Stalinists infiltrating America, but yet you have literal fucking neo-Nazis in our spaces, and you're defending them.
Right.
And especially for me, Charlottesville was really what set it off for me. Because I remember this. Okay, I don't know if you're familiar, Liam, with James Alsop.
I think so.
Google's it, but he's on the SPLC's hate list. He also was. Long story short, this was a guy that was on the Students for Rand campaign with me back.
Yeah. No, I remember the name.
Yeah, and what happened was he was the Washington State chair, and you already saw the fucking. And I was seeing the shit he was posted, logging in, and saying to people what the fuck. Why is this guy still tolerated? Essentially, what also happened was when Charlottesville happened, because he was at that fucking rally the day before where they did the tiki torches, and I'm this motherfucker was, and he's in that famous picture He's in the back, and I didn't even. It wasn't even like I doxed him. He was on the Washington cover of Washington Post. So I posted up there. I'm like, hey, this guy is a fucking neo-Nazi. And I got lit up. I got lit up by libertarians who called me a cuck, a fucking commie bastard. They called me a pinko. I got called fucking like race traitor. I got called.
Right. Yeah.
You know what's funny? The people. I mean, some libertarians did stand up for me, but like the fact that I got like, fuck you, Connor. Why are you like trying to suck up to the libs? I'm like, wow, that's great coming from you. Oh, fucking Holocaust denier. And just posted the screenshot of him right there in his comment. I'm like, and that same guy stole one of my fucking Instagram photos, blasted me on his Twitter. Like, it's like, oh, James was like, oh, look at this fat fuck. Calls me not a human being, and look at him. I got lit up, death threats, race. I didn't take any of that shit seriously. At the point, hey, you fucking Nazi bastards want to kill me? Go ahead. You just made me a martyr. And it's like, but the people that were explicitly open there fighting them on my public social media, that weren't just like, oh, I condemn these guys, like, but they're still, some of them were still falling into like both, like the anti-fascists are the same. Like, the only people that did not try to like somehow whitewash their shit or equate them with the leftists there were the actual socialists there. They were out there on my, like, defending me, like, actually, and also attacking these guys virulently. You know why? Because they're like, hey, Connor, you may have been a libertarian, you may have been a right-wing libertarian, but like, you're not batshit. Like, you're not. And it just, for me, like, the fact that how many and the fact that these guys lasted so long in our spaces, like, we're supposed to care about individual liberty, right? Freedom. Nazism is like say what you want about whatever, the Soviet Union, communism, Stalinism. Nazism is the exact opposite of that. And yet
it's explicitly anti-individualist. You know, it really is a kind of like, I mean, nationalism as a whole is always a collectivist philosophy, and libertarians love to say that they're the individualists and they're for individual liberty. But so to align with a kind of nationalist or racist view like that, you're explicitly adopting a kind of collectivist mindset.
And for me, and that's where a lot of it was just like the fact that how many libertarians, not only like, I mean, there were those that were speaking out, but they were like you're like actual left libertarians, but like essentially like your Center for the Stateless Society types. But I was like, how many people were silent or like tolerated his ass for so long? And the fact that people called out, oh, you're trying to be a white knight for like wanting to kick these fuckers out of your space. It's like, no, I'm asexual, asshole. I just don't want fucking Nazis in my space. It's like, and it's,
right. I think one of the things that comes through here is not only that we need to step out of the safe spaces to some extent and talk to other people to be exposed to different ideas, and that makes it somewhat possible to evolve in your positions. But I think one of the other things that makes it really, really, well, easier, I guess, I mean, or even possible, is that you have to take your own ideas seriously. Because I think that's what comes through for me with you and with a number of other people that I've seen who are on the libertarian right. And I know a number of people who still are libertarian right-wingers, hardcore pro-capitalist, this and that. But they also consistently will stick up for and defend leftists as well against that kind of, pinko commie scum, helicopter jokes, that sort of thing. Because they take seriously the liberty aspect of it, that people should be able to find their own way, take their own positions. I mean, if your ideas can't stand up in the market, if your philosophy cannot stand up in the marketplace of ideas, how the hell are you even talking about free market stuff? What are you even talking about freedom for? You're trying to shut out those opposing views. Yeah. I mean, any so-called libertarian who will not tolerate the existence of communists or socialists is basically telling you they don't really want any kind of freedom or tolerance for different ideas. They want some kind of explicit authoritarian solution. Yeah. So I think what helps is if you take your own ideas seriously enough to start with, that you're able to look at and see the contradictions in them, if you can see some of the nuances and flaws, if you're able to recognize where your own position isn't perfect, but you do have a set of defined principles that are, I guess, how do I put that? Maybe decoupled from a particular identity or a tribe. You know, our politics is pretty tribalistic, isn't it? People identify with a party, they identify with an ideology. You know, I'm an ANCAP, I'm a conservative, I'm a Republican. Like, they have this thing, and like, it's a label, right? If you're able to find what values you have that align you with that in the first place, maybe it helps to walk through a lot of these other things, you know? I mean, think about how many of the people who think that they became right libertarians because they support freedom, but they really just did because they love racism.
Yeah.
You know, they hate the idea of civil liberties laws, and they want the freedom to discriminate. That's all that they really care about. But most of them will not be able to admit that. They can't look you in the eyes and say, yeah, I just want to be racist as fuck.
Yeah.
They have to bury it in a layer of bullshit. I think maybe if there's not only an openness to engagement with other people, but also a greater awareness of your own beliefs, of what your own principles are.
The other issue too is also that, but like I've come to the conclusion though that some ideologies are just not worth debating. And I know, like, while there's nothing wrong, and that's where I prefer dialogue over debate, because the frame of a debate is to really, you're trying to win a dialogue. You're trying to like, and that's where, like, I think, you know what? Sorry, fascism should not be debated.
Yeah.
Nazism
Exactly.
should not be debated.
I mean, I would say that you can have a discussion or a dialogue with somebody, because the effort then is to try and understand their perspective, find the issues, and then see if you can help them find their way back out of it, or, you know, leave breadcrumbs for them to find their way back out of it. But if you're engaging in a debate with a Nazi, you're explicitly saying this is a respectable position and it would be okay if I lost and their idea won. And it's really not. It's really not okay.
It's also this weird thing too, where like it's, especially for me, and even when I was still a libertarian, it was still like, how the fuck can you equate in the U.S. context white supremacists with anti-fascists being terrorists? Like if you're just
right.
Like, do you see Stalinists here shooting up schools? Do you see anarchists here bombing abortion clinics? Do you see, hell, even the closest thing would be like the Animal Liberation Front, but they never killed anyone. They only attacked property.
Right. What's the death toll for anti-fascism in the U.S.? I mean, hello. I mean, whereas white supremacists kill people every single year and engage in constant violent attacks.
And there's no debate the fact that white supremacy is basically infests police departments in this country and the military. And also the fact that, look, okay, it's not fucking socialists. It's not, hell, this is where, like, I think there's, even on the left, they fixate too much on, like, whatever, Stalinist or Juche stance. Like, they're not the threat. I don't see nor DRPK, unironic DRPK supporters committing war crimes here in the U.S. And that's where, like, whatever, you want to post a giant statue of Stalin in your room? Okay, cool. You're not a threat to me. You're not a threat to anyone.
Whereas white nationalists are literally killing people every single year, and Christian nationalists are killing people.
And
I mean, you mentioned the abortion clinic bombings.
They are arming themselves. Like,
Yeah, I mean, hell, I mean, what? It's 30 years now that, you know, FBI has been saying that, you know, white supremacists are a legitimate terrorist threat in the U.S.
So, I'm just gonna be right back. My battery's on 2%. I'm still, but yeah, it's just like, you can't equate them. You can't equate. It's where, like, this weird thing to where, like, it's also where, like, I think the left here in the U.S. still is pretty weak, and it's like, I'm kind of glad that I am absolutely glad there is a burgeoning anti-fascist movement coming back, but it's like, the reality is that I find that even the federal government is still not, and I mean, in my own take, I don't think they're willing to, because they are.
Yeah, there's a trick there too, and this is I don't know, it's a tough one because as soon as you acknowledge that there is a problem of white supremacy within military or police forces, there's a tendency for people to think that you're basically calling all cops racists or all cops Nazis or something, and it makes it difficult to discuss it. I mean, it is absolutely undeniable. We keep finding, police officers with known neo-Nazi affiliations who also happen to have a long record of attacking minorities. But this doesn't somehow mean that every cop is a racist. I mean, it makes it hard to have those discussions because, again, people lose the sense of nuance. They lose the gray areas in it, because we get so caught up in a kind of like tribalistic identity. And it makes you, really, I don't know, almost pessimistic in a way that we can even deal with these problems, because if people are going to get all worked up and all snowflakey about that, I mean, if you point out, hey, guess what? There's some racist cops. Like, no, there aren't. And then next thing you know, you got your thin blue lines slapped up everywhere and people are just like super hardcore for it and it becomes a massive issue. And then, any attempt at, dealing with the systemic problem disappears. Right? You're just sort of stuck.
Well, again, if it's something that's so systemic, is it worth solving? And that's where, again, like I will say, yeah, abolish police. And then and that's correct. There's actually I'm glad there's a growing movement of like abolitionists or alternatives to contemporary policing in the U.S. And that's where, like, how do I say it? If something is so rotten to the core, is it worth saving? And that's where, like, I think law enforcement in the U.S. at that point, you can't reform it. You cannot, because its very nature is there to enforce the status quo. And what is the status quo?
And I get that. And I think the bigger problem that I have with a lot of those, especially since, again, I come from an inherently anti-authoritarian standpoint, I think my problem with a lot of those kind of positions is more strategic than anything else. Because, as soon as you adopt that kind of position, as soon as you are aggressively pushing back against something like that, what you end up with is a kind of defensive reaction, and you're more likely to have people start aligning much more explicitly with authoritarian views and sort of like neo-fascist views. I mean, that thin blue line actually is not just, hey, I think police are kind of cool. It actually has some serious authoritarian and racist baggage attached to it. All Lives Matter has some serious white supremacist baggage attached to it. But people lose that. It becomes a kind of broader rallying cry that just, whatever Democratic granny can kind of like, align with. Oh, yeah, police aren't such a bad person. My neighbor was a policeman. And then next thing you know, they are, unbeknownst to them, siding with, all of that, and nothing gets done. It kind of puts people on the defensive. And I guess I don't know how we can really reform things. I would love to see a return to basically like community policing. People sort of electing people in their neighborhood to have the right to kind of like, patrol around and make sure nothing's going wrong, make sure everyone's safe. But they're literally out of your own community and they know you,
but also
as opposed to, a kind of externally imposed police force, which frequently has a sense of feeling like an occupying army.
But the other issue too is this. How do I say it? How can you expect people not to fight? Not to say fight. I don't know if the right word. God, the lighting here sucks. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no, you're almost completely black. We should probably just wind up soon anyway.
Yeah, you know what? I mean, the issue that I find is that you're not going to be able to stop the issue with, again, policing will not change in this country unless the fundamental economic and social system is basically completely reversed. And it also will not help that as long as cops are armed. I'm sorry, cops. The presence of law enforcement will only escalates things. They are the way they're training is the culture within law enforcement, and also the fact of the matter is that how to say it, if they're packing, why should we trust them when they're dealing with an unarmed population? and police have a lot more legal protection for themselves
They certainly have that.
when they do fucked up shit, and they do
Right.
fucked up shit all the time. And that's where it's like, I don't think you can reform that. And the fact is that the types of personalities that and people that become cops, especially now, usually are problematic. Are almost all, and again, those that do tend to actually have a good heart in it, for example, almost always either become cynical, basically fold into the same department culture, or they fucking leave.
Yeah, and I've known people who've done both. Who've fallen into it or left it entirely. I think then one of the problems, and again, there are certain strategic questions that I have, because you can acknowledge the difficulty of fixing something like this, but as soon as you put people on the defensive, you really do have kind of a problem. How can you even have a conversation? People are basically tuning you out, and they refuse then to hear the actual legitimate complaints about things or any kind of alternative, because they've sort of like they feel personally threatened in it. And I think one of the difficulties for me, and this actually affects tons of other areas, discussions of like bigger systems, because it's the systems that do things. You mentioned some of the people who get into policing are themselves problematic. I agree. There are plenty of people who get involved in policing because they like the idea of beating other people up. They were kind of like, as a kid, they were kind of like a bully or a narc or something. They liked a sense of power. This is not to say that all people are like that, but some people like that, are attracted to it. The way to deal with that is actually to change the way that people are recruited and the way that people are trained. I mean, we actually have police departments saying that we want a maximum intelligence for police, because any smart police person is going to leave later, and they're literally looking for average or lower intelligence. I mean, how does that make sense? I mean, the military does all kinds of psychological evaluations to work out if I'm going to make this person like heavily armed and trained, I want to know this person is like psychologically stable. We don't put the same effort into recruiting police. And we also, police training in the country is frequently like 8 months, 10 months. In Europe, it's 2 to 3 years.
The other issue too is also the fact that, especially in California, like for example, like if you're trying to become a teacher in the state, for example, like you need a bachelor's.
Mm-hmm.
You got to pass the CBEST to apply to the program. That's not counting credential requirements. And if you're trying to go, depending on what field, you have to get so many credentials, pass exams.
Mm-hmm.
You got to, and there's how many hours, and the fact that you don't get your actual full credential until after 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
The barrier to entry is disproportionately higher than becoming a cop. And the fact of the matter is, you could have no 19-year-old kid go straight into the academy, no job experience, nothing. He's paid to be in the academy, and the fact that like he can get as much overtime as he wants, and usually the benefits are better than for teachers across the country. As a whole, the fact that cops make more on average than teachers in any given state shows the fact that the status quo, where are the priorities at?
Right, and completely. I mean, teachers often struggle to make a living all across this country, but police
never do. They
are much better off. Yeah, it is. I think the bigger issue there really then gets back to the overall systems. Then the training and recruitment requirements there. So less a matter of saying this or that person is always bad for getting into it, in a matter of like we're creating a kind of corrupt system that inherently produces bad results and cranks out people who are not well equipped to handle this. I mean, if you're going to get 3 years of training to be a police officer in a European country, and a lot of that is geared toward de-escalation training, and in the US you get 10 months of training and a whole lot of that is geared toward target practice and how to take people down, then your toolkits are completely different. One sort of predisposes you to a violent solution, and the other does not.
The other issue too is also the fact that matters but it's also like, what does policing serve? And then that's again like, policing at the end of the day serves to protect the status quo, not necessarily enforce order or protect lives.
Right.
It is their entire existence are that is essentially to protect whoever is set them up. They function in many ways better than a private security force.
It's why so much of the left will refer to police as class traitors, because essentially you are serving the ruling class, you're serving the owner class, and your basic job is to protect property. I mean, so much of what becomes policing eventually in the U.S. actually does have its origins in protecting the slave trade and slavery in the South. I mean, it's protecting property and property rights, not people and communities, which is where, like, for me as an ideal, I would love to see a kind of elected community patrol, something more like if instead of a police force, we had neighborhood watches that were sort of like really empowered to take care of things, and that was who you turned to, and they were people that you knew and trusted, and you knew they were good people already. And if, like, I don't know, Johnny starts to show signs of instability and we don't want Johnny walking the streets anymore with his baton, we can actually vote him out of it too, which is a fundamentally different concept too. But I think it's hard to even have a conversation where you get people to consider community policing as an alternative to it when people end up getting pushed onto the defensive. And it really gets back to this question of, like, how do we introduce nuance into conversation? How do we get people to the table, to sit around the table in the first place and have a conversation when you're dehumanizing the other side from the beginning, when you're calling them, like, commies or this or that, and, like, shutting them out. Yep. And I'm sure you can sort of relate to that just in the way that libertarians have reacted to you, to any nuance in your positions, and sort of, like, lashing out and attacking you, And I don't know how many times I've had, like, the neo-Nazi types come after me if I try to, like, I mean, because I have a history of, like, attacking things like Holocaust denial and pretty aggressively putting down their arguments. And some of them don't really like that, And you end up with a kind of tribalistic, violent response. Yep. I don't know where we can go as a society when people's go-to option is to say, I'm going to kick your ass or whatever. I'm going to kill you. Yep. I don't know how we start talking to each other again.
And the other thing, too, I mean, and that's where, like, I think it's not even, it's like my overall belief is that it's cultural, not even, and, like, it's not just ideologically, because, like, the fact of the matter is that the left here in the U.S. is so still fragmented, divided, and useless. Like, the fact that you still have people fighting about Kronstadt, the Kronstadt uprising. It's like, yeah, whatever. How is that relevant here? Why does that matter?
People are replaying the battles from, like, the 19th and 20th century and not paying attention. Yeah, they'll get, like, really, really worked up over something in the Spanish Civil War, or, something in the Russian Revolution, or, like, this or that. Like, do you remember, like, the Marx versus Bakunin debate? I'm like, no, that's kind of before my time.
Also, it's also like, for a worker here in the U.S. who's like, cool, I'm still going to get evicted from my apartment because I lost my job.
It's irrelevant, yeah. It's like, where people can be more attracted to the populist right and the sort of illusions of working class solidarity that you get from your neo-fascist types like Trump, who will make the right noises and say, I care about you, while they're meanwhile fucking you. But there's no credible alternative anymore. We don't have someone out there actually trying to boil down these ideas and reach out to people. I mean, there's no Eugene Debs types anymore. Yeah, the left attacks itself and ignores the working class.
It's also, like, the fact that, like, and also, like, the issue is, like, a lot of the issue that I find, especially the internet left, like, a lot of it's like, go talk to people, like, and that's where, like, I think especially the tenants organizing is making a massive comeback here. Especially because I've been kind of plugged into the LA Tennis Network. That's making a comeback, I think, is a good thing. And it's like, oh, look, you got a guest star.
Yeah. She's been...
But yeah, it's just, and the fact that, like, and this is what's ironic. Like, I've been in a lot of spaces where you have both anarchists and, again, maybe more MLs, or like authoritarian versus, but, like, we actually get along very well, because the notion's like, okay, we're out there doing the mutual aid work. We're out there doing community defense. We're out there organizing. We're out there trying to build something. The first thing that goes in, like, there's an old saying, when you're in the trenches, the first thing gets tossed out, ideology. And that's where like it's the fact we actually agree on so much. And what's actually ironic, I'm seeing a lot of parallels back when I was libertarian, where you have like ANCAPs fighting the minarchist, and it's like bro, who the fuck cares? Like it's this weird
Right.
like nerd debate. It's nerd debate. It's theory wonk stuff, and that's where it's like.
Mm-hmm.
And also I will say this, like, some of the most successful revolutions have been syncretic or multi-tendency. That's where you look at like
Right.
even Castro, like the 26th July movement was actually fairly multi-tendency. The Iranian Revolution 79 was multi-tendency, and it's like even in South America, like a lot of some of the better like electoral successes. I mean, say what you want about Chavez. I have my own opinion on the guy. I think he's mostly good, but like the issue is like he was able to build a wide base. The Sandinistas in Nicaragua, wide base. Even the Vietnam, like you had a fairly wide base, and that's where like no. At the end of the day, nobody gives a shit that you're a tanky or an anarchist. I just want to I want a good life. I want to.
Right. And this, again, for me, and even extending beyond just solidarity among different left movements, is I just wish people could sit around the table and talk to each other. I mean, if you could get just generic liberals and generic socialists around a table and talk, they would find areas of common agreement as well as disagreement. And if you can find those areas of agreement, you can work together. And if you can build larger coalitions, you can actually accomplish more. I think one of the ways that the right consistently outmaneuvers the left and center in the U.S. is that they're willing to paper over massive differences in their beliefs and rally around a much smaller number of ones they have in common. And leftists are much more likely to, invoke the circular firing squad, and we just take each other out for various reasons and refuse to actually to work together.
Or like the fact that like, oh, you're or like you're again like the fact that Stalinist is still used as a term is just doesn't make sense to me. Like I'm not even like the biggest fan of again, my views on Stalin have definitely evolved. But I'm not gonna say like I'm like he was the greatest thing ever happened, but it's also like I'm not gonna just throw him out completely because it's frankly it's also you're going to the great when you this is one of my other big critiques. Suppose leftists still kind of fall under the great man thing. They still focus on the person, like Stalinism, Maoism. Like
right? Yeah.
Like even anarchists do this. Anarchists like Stalin's. It's like Stalin was still at the end of the day one person in the entire Soviet system. There was a lot of other stuff too. I mean, he did affect a lot, but like you're denying the agency and the actions of
tons of other people. Yeah. Yeah, and you're right. A lot of anarchists even can get into that same kind of like hero worship and identify themselves with it. I mean, the whole like Mach Novus type, like you'll come up with a particular strain of it that you identify with, or a particular thinker. Like I'm a Stirnerian type like egoist or whatever, or I follow this or that tradition. It's and at the end of the day, we get so much more done out of the kind of productive disagreement and like the sharing of different ideas and tossing things around.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately for me, that's one of the problems with the Soviet system is that it itself shut out so much of that debate and, killed off its own diversity. And that ultimately weakened the society. I think the more open a society is to a disagreement, the easier it is to spread ideas in the first place, to get people talking and thinking about them. Whereas if you sort of like clamp down on them, you inevitably create reactions to it. I mean, look at how, Russia has essentially embraced neo-fascism under Putin, which is pretty far away from the Soviet model, but it's a reaction to the oppression of it, in the same way that there's a lot of people within the Arab world that identify with very reactionary views of the Islamists, largely because they were heavily suppressed. Whereas if there's an attempt to kind of like engage with it, it's a little easier to sort of like neuter the worst tendencies of it. And
that's where like a lot of it, I do think a lot of it does boil down to, a lot of supposed authoritarian tendencies or like actions or philosophies are basically fed into by, again, when everything looks like a boot, you keep clamping down. You keep clamping down. That's where, like, yeah, a lot of, how to say, like, you will make these, again, whatever the reactionary or ultra radical, because I don't think the horseshoe theory is relevant. I think it's
No.
flawed in a lot of ways.
The horseshoe is essentially bunk. There are conspiracy theorists and racists on any side, but the horseshoe theory is bunk.
Yeah, and that's where, like, it's. But I do think the commonality is still that if you're constantly, again, and this is where, like, I kind of, I mean, again, I have my own opinions on Hamas, for example, but like or like the different factions within the Palestinian people, but it's like, there's a reason they still have a relatively wide-based support. And it's like, especially when you're living in a fucking open-air prison camp, and it's getting smaller and smaller through annexation by the Israeli state. You've been clamped on, surveyed on, you can't go back home, you can't leave. I can't blame people for latching on to whatever is the most effective thing fighting back. And it's...
Yeah, and that's the hard part there. It really gets to where you can't have really effective or productive discussions that can solve problems unless you're willing to acknowledge the circumstances of the other. It's very easy for us in a situation of privilege to condemn the horrific atrocity of say, a Hamas setting off a bomb in a cafe or a bus or something like that, and like, who would want to live in the fear that like your bus could explode or something. But if you can understand the situation in which they live and the sense of desperation and nihilism that bubbles up in the first place, then you're a step closer to being able to talk to people. And as long as you can take that sort of absolutist, like, I don't negotiate with terrorists and you can't like talk. I mean, I don't know. You mentioned the Irish earlier. Just think about, we didn't move anywhere closer to calming things down until the British government was willing to talk to the IRA without the precondition of them disarming. And in the process, they could work out a deal that could disarm the IRA and, take away the bombings in London or whatever there. But as long as they were maintaining that kind of position that we will not talk to you or acknowledge that you have any legitimate grievance until you stop fighting us, they got literally nowhere. And I think that's ultimately the problem with Hamas. I think that it is... I mean, for me, in a position of privilege, it's pretty easy to condemn the sort of atrocities of Hamas. But I also have to point out that there is no ability to solve this problem until you can recognize the motivations of Hamas and sit across the table with them and say, we got to work this shit out.
And also, Israel seems like it's going to move the exact opposite direction of even trying to talk.
Well, that's honestly been a long-term pattern. It's one of the things that it frustrates me about the entire thing, and people talking about a peace process or whatever, and that Israel always wants peace. They have consistently gone out of their way to avoid actually engaging productively with whoever they have there. It's just it gets to be much more complex there because you're dealing with two conflicting nationalisms that both claim the entire territory. Yep. And that's one of the problems with a lot of nationalist movements is they get worked up around a particular chunk of territory, and they can't recognize the inherent diversity. If they were able to recognize a common Israeli-Palestinian nationalism that both claimed it and could work toward a kind of shared unitary solution there, then they would both be able to live comfortably in the same land. But they have to first acknowledge each other's humanity and the validity of their claims.
Which, again, like, that's not a realistic at this stage. Like, it's, as long as Israel is still supported by, and I think the winds are starting to shift, at least with the Europeans, to a degree. Because, I mean, hey, to Ireland for actually making a statement.
Yeah, it's been an interesting attempt. Yeah.
And that's, but I will say, of course, it would be the Irish doing it first. But, but it's like, the thing is still, like, as long as the United States is still able to support Israel, Israel will still continue. Because, again, I do think most of the, even for example, I had family members that are conservative as fuck, but they're like texting me like, Connor, you're kind of right about Palestine. Like, yeah, Israel's fucking just mass killing people. Like, you're starting to see the wind shifting culturally, and the policy wonks in DC and the establishment types are not going to change that. But I do think it's starting to change because, like, there's just, you cannot deny what the shit on Twitter you're seeing coming out of the occupied territories.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see the debates shifting over time. Gosh, when I was growing up, if anybody even heard of a Palestinian, the only association they had was a guy wearing a balaclava, carrying a Kalashnikov, and trying to hijack a plane. We just thought Palestinian equals terrorist because we only paid attention to the Israeli narrative on it. There is a bit more nuance in it now, in that we are seeing the opposed sides, and that can change the situation a bit. I think the bigger question there, though, and something a bit more relevant to the discussion we were having about these kind of political evolutions, is it honestly doesn't matter what anybody on the outside really thinks. Israelis and Palestinians have to acknowledge each other's humanity and have to sit down and talk. And there's no real effort to do that yet. There's still a massive effort to deny the existence and claims of the other. And I think until that really changes and people are willing to sit across and talk, we're not really going to see a solution to it. So you're right, it is pretty darn distant. But it's because there needs to be a cultural change within Israel-Palestine, and people have to be willing to acknowledge that need to talk to each other. Yeah. And I think that ultimately is the only way that we get any kind of progress or any kind of substantive change. But I guess it might be a good place to wind down, especially since you've lost all light in that room. It is super dark.
Oh yeah, it's. I mean, I part of me is still optimistic, but I'm still kind of cynical. It's just the issue that I think the issue is that it's going to be the Palestinian people themselves, and my own personal opinion. You're not going to see anything revolutionary here in the U.S. relative. It's going to be people in the global South, outside the West, because I do think at the end of the day that. Because we're in the core, it's going to be hard to give up shit. And because, again, our lifestyle, our economic system is propped up through the oppression and stolen shit from the people in the global South.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I think if we're not willing to give it up, these privileges that are basically built on the backs of enslavement and war crimes, then
all we're doing is justifying a kind of neocolonialism, and just the same crap trundles on and on and on.
And that's where I do think there's some especially more Marxist-Leninist Maoist types are have a good point. The fact that there is a labor aristocracy. There absolutely is. And especially here in the U.S. I mean, the fact that given how much the white working class has been used as a tool against smashing any kind of leftist absurd. Sorry,
right? Yeah. There are serious issues with the manipulation of I don't know, so-called lumpen proletariats and petit bourgeois. I mean, there's just tons of ways in which you set people at odds and get them to justify the existing power relations. So it makes it harder and harder to get any kind of real systemic change. And I think part of it gets back to a kind of educational emphasis. I'm really happy to see when I see mutual aid networks spring up, because there's something organic about it. It's something I loved about some of the activism you saw back with the Black Panther Party, when they were actually going out and providing services to people in their communities. There's something to be said for any kind of mutual aid networks that can sort of spring up, and they provide an opportunity also to engage in real discussion about how to solve these deeper problems. But as long as it saves a bunch of people squabbling on the internet or whatever, you don't really get anywhere.
Yeah.
We actually have to get out there in the world and do it. And to some extent, that it gets you back to a kind of, I don't know, say a more Gramscian view of socialism versus the revolutionary Marxist-Leninist type. It's get out there and actually educate people, sort of get involved in the basic dialogue and educate. I think that ultimately helps people to find their own paths to liberation, whether you're talking about national liberation struggles or liberation within any kind of the Western world, so to speak, the developed world. There's there's still a need for us to cross-examine our own ideology, so to speak.
Yeah. But yeah, and that's where and that's the thing. There's a lot of self-reflection, self-critique that has to happen before anything significant happens.
Right. And that gets uncomfortable for people. And it gets very easy to sort of tune out any kind of discussion or criticism, and to throw up personal defenses against that. Oh, you hate America, why don't you move to Cuba? I'm like, that's kind of not the point. But we have to find some way to power through that and be able to have those kind of shared discussions where we can engage in sort of like substantive critique and, learn from our mistakes and improve on things, I mean, any project, no matter how much you like a particular one, can be improved upon.
Yep.
There has been, in many ways, a kind of, this is where I'm kind of more optimistic than cynical. I mean, obviously the study of history, you do constantly see all the mistakes and the violence and all the horrific stuff we do to each other, but I am at the same time relatively optimistic because for all the false starts and mistakes and problems that show up in different places, there is a steady march toward greater human liberty, toward respect for more rights. There's a sense that we're willing to protect people different from us in ways that we never used to before, and that I think is I don't know. There's something inspiring in that. We can keep improving upon this. But anyway, so this has been fun.
Yep.
So for anybody just that has managed to sit through all of this, so yeah, I'm Liam O'Mara. This has been Conor McGarry. We've been having a fun little conversation here about changes and dialogue, and obviously tons of it ended up veering into discussions of socialism, and that's all really cool. And we want to keep doing things like this, have discussions with people on something that interests you. So if you're interested in talking about something, let me know. And if you like these silly videos, just hit like and subscribe and all that business. So once again, office hours with the Mad Professor. Liam O'Mara. Have a good night.
Thank you for having me on, Liam.
Yep. Have a good one.